All right, we're gonna get started with the next part of this. So if we can have people come in, grab their seats. If I could get everybody's attention. All right. So we heard from three leaders in the federal government who are thinking about these issues. If I could just get people's attention, that'd be great. Thank you. Who are really thinking about these issues. So much of the action is at the state. The states are where lots and lots of policy making happens. And so I'm super excited about our next part of the conversation, which will be a conversation between me and Chelsea Canada. So Chelsea, if you want to come up. She works at the National Council of State Legislatures, has worked in the state legislature in Colorado and New Mexico, works on issues of technology and privacy, and I will not keep going beyond that and say that we're going to start with some broad questions, and we're going to speak for about 15 minutes.
All right, so thank you. So I claimed that states are doing a lot in this space.
Yes.
So what are states doing in this space?
Yeah, no, thank you for queuing it up. But before I jump in, if you don't mind, I want to get a temperature of the room of who knows what the National Conference of State Legislatures is, and if you've heard of us before. By a raise of hands, can you show me? Okay, about half of you. So I'm going to give a quick spiel so you can understand where my perspective's coming from. The National Conference of State Legislatures is a national, nonpartisan, bipartisan organization. We're very unique because our members are legislators and the legislative institutions themselves. And so what I do at NCSL is I work on one of our policy teams out of Denver, and we produce unbiased policy research to give back to members so they know what their colleagues are doing in other states. We don't give recommendations to them, but we try and facilitate communication and innovation so that they can learn from each other, because we really believe that these legislative institutions are the laboratories of democracy. So I just wanted to put that spiel out there quickly, before I jump in. But at NCSL, I have a pretty busy policy portfolio. I cover technology and privacy, and so other than this topic that I'm discussing today, I also cover AI, and it's rapidly changing every day with new proposals coming online, new proposals being challenged in both spaces. And so what we've seen is a stark increase over the past few years on not only the number of states introducing these bills, but the number of proposals out there. And so by my count right now, we're over, just for 2024 alone in this area, we're over 300 proposals floating out there. And last year, just to give context, there were like 200 proposals in the space, and then the year prior to that, there were only 25. So you could see how rapidly increasing this is. But this year alone, there have been 30 enactments, which has been big. And so, because this is an emerging area, and like you heard from our federal Congress people, that there's been laws on the books for a long time. But as you all know, with the advent of social media, the advent of generative AI, it's rapidly changing. Quickly, I want to note, though, as you saw at the federal level, these are bipartisan proposals across the states. It's not just blue states taking one approach, red states taking one approach. Legislators and leaders across the nation are so concerned, hearing from their constituents and trying to react, especially in the context of slow-moving legislation at the federal level. And so they're really trying to step up and fill that gap.
So let's talk a little bit about what some of those enactments are.
Yeah.
What are states doing? And I guess as you think about that, it really feels like COSA will get through, that it looks like it's got Senate, House support. How much will that help, hurt, hinder, change? So first, just tell us what's happening at the state level.
Yeah.
And then if the federal action does move forward, how does that change what happens at the state level?
Okay, sure. Well, I'm glad that the dean let you all go get your food, so I'm not in between folks'. I hate being in between people's lunch, especially with some dense content. So thanks for your attention. But we're really trying to bucket kind of these policy areas as they're emerging. What we've seen legislators doing is, sharpening their pencils, erasing and sharpening again, because it's really, they're backing up against some legal challenges and being influenced by not only national law, but international law. So the 4 different buckets that I'll dive into more with folks is, the first one is around privacy and age appropriateness. And so that really is embedded within like the design of these platforms and what minors can do within these platforms and how it's different than the content that's given to adults. So that's a bucket. There's also a growing number of states who are looking at and passing age verification and parent consent bills. And then there's also a new emerging area that we've seen bills popping up this year are protections for minors who are content creators, which I wanted to highlight. There's only a few bills that have been passed in that area so far, but it's an interesting one because of how many young people are being creative on these platforms. And then the fourth one, and you heard a lot about this today too, is really about social media use in schools. And so that could be specifically towards use of social media or, banning or having some sort of policies around cell phone use.
Got it. COSA, if it passes and gets signed by the president, it seems to cover some of the ground that you're saying states are doing.
Yeah.
How do you see that changing the landscape of what states would do next after COSA is signed, let's say, into law?
Yeah, there has been a lot of discussion and debate around that. We have members reach out to us daily about, hey, what's the status of, there's a ton of lawsuits about on bills that states have passed. Like, what are the status of these from our other states as they're looking and drafting their legislation? But I don't have a crystal ball, but what I'm hearing from members is it's kind of a wait and see right now with that bill so close to the finish line. They're at the ready with their bills drafted, and we're gearing up for another session. A lot of legislatures convene in January, so they're getting their runway set out right now. But there are some differences with the federal legislation. You heard from some of the members about what that legislation does, and one of the things they pointed out was, age verification, which is different, a different perspective than the states have. The states right now in federal law, and you heard this from many of you in this room because you're very familiar with this content area, there is current federal law that is supposed to prohibit access to these platforms for youth under 13. But as you heard from many of the youth in the room today, you could have your Finsta, you could put in whatever you want, make whatever persona you want. And so legislators are really concerned about the implementation of that federal law. And so they're finding it in their bucket and responsibility to really make sure that there's enforcement. So in that specific area, and I think that's why there's been such an increase of states proposing that, that there would actually be age verification. So either written consent from a parent or providing a government ID, and in some cases, raising that threshold from 13-year-olds to 16-year-olds to 18-year-olds. I will say there are a lot of legal challenges that some of the trade associations are bringing forward that would really push back against this. They're not.
And when you say trade associations, you mean social media company,
Yes. Yes.
lobbying groups, et cetera. But
Yes. Yes. So one of the big ones is Tech Choice. They're the trade association for Meta, for X, for Pinterest, for all of these different companies, and they have gotten temporary injunctive relief in most of the states that they've put a complaint forward to. And so a lot of these bills are on pause right now, especially in the age verification space, but then also within California's design code law. I don't know if you all are familiar with that.
can you take a minute to explain that one? Because I think
Yeah.
it's important. It's obviously California, but it's a different way of thinking about the problem, right?
Yeah, totally. So this law was really inspired by a law in the UK to focus on children's privacy, but then also to get their hands around, so companies and legislators, on what are the impacts to children and thinking through that, and what is the business case for having this function for, this group of constituents, and really having to explain that and think through that. An interesting thing I'll note from the legislation in the UK, so it was introduced in 2020, it was implemented in 2021, but some platforms, because they cross borders, they've changed some of their settings on their platforms. So for example, on TikTok, for a certain age range, now minors are only getting comments from their friends. Another example I'll pull is YouTube. For minors, they've taken off the option for that autoplay that'll get you, and the algorithm will get you down these deep holes. So that's what the UK did. California modeled their legislation off of that, but was quickly challenged by these trade companies, and so it's on pause right now. But a caveat there I'll note is California, sharpened their pencils again this year, and passed a flurry of legislation, not only in AI, but targeted towards social media and youth. But their recent legislation that just passed, that folks are gearing up to challenge again, which is different than the design code, is really specific to the algorithm. Even though the design code is looking at the design of the platform and having restrictions around it, this one specifically, because they're just trying to take another bite at the apple of what is constitutional and what can get through, focuses on making sure that your feed is not fed by an algorithm. It's more like only your friends are getting into your feed. And then a big change too is making sure that it's chronological. So there's not some sort of algorithm behind picking up and choosing for you.
I guess the last question is looking forward. So there is going to be more and more action often coming out of Europe, because Europe often is more aggressive on these kinds of things. Certainly the EU is. That shifts things. We are seeing this pushback. What is, and I realize in some ways it's an unfair question because I'm asking you to peer into a crystal ball and no one knows for sure. But if you think out to 2025, and where do you think state legislatures are going? And what are the topics that you think they're going to kind of focus their attention on to try to basically create more safety for kids online?
Yeah, totally. That's a really great question. And yes, I do not have a crystal ball, sorry. But I think it really boils down to the action at the federal level, one, that I mentioned, but then also, two, how these court cases are shaking out amongst the states. There's a ton of different defenses that they have, from First Amendment concerns to even tech companies saying, like, hey, these new laws will actually create more problems because we're collecting minors' data to verify them, which has been an interesting argument. So I think states are really just in a wait and see period. But I will note that states are increasingly focused on privacy. And this intersects with not only social media, but we've been seeing the increase in interest because of AI and how important data is there. And so one thing I'll note is we've seen an increase of states passing comprehensive data privacy laws. And just this year, 8 of those states put in specific requirements around minors' data. And so that's something I would keep an eye on, because I don't think it's front and center most of the time in these conversations. But states are increasingly in the AI space and in the social media and kids space looking at how are we protecting minors' data.
Yeah, great. So I think we will wrap up just to get to the next session, but I want to say a couple of quick things. First of all, I've had the opportunity to speak in front of the National Conference. It is an extraordinary group of legislators, really from across the entire political spectrum, but trying to solve real problems. And the examples that you brought up is a really good reminder of this cliche, but it is a totally true cliche of states being the laboratory of democracy in America. It seems to me like we're still early in our journey of figuring out how we're going to manage, regulate, oversee social media, and I suspect that while it'd be great to get some federal legislation, most of the learning will happen from different states trying different things and seeing which work and which don't. And so thank you for keeping your finger on that pulse for us and reporting to us, and for your leadership in this area as well. So Chelsea, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we have a question from Alan. Or question, comment?
One of the things when you talk about trade associations, there are trade associations that go completely against the social media trade associations. And we're the ones that advertise them. So
Right.
don't forget, I mean, if I just take the Toy Industry Association, which is, 500-600 members, we advertise a lot on some of these things. We can use don't forget us, because we're the people that can counter the others.
It's a great, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, it's a great example of how it's a very complex ecosystem, and you can marshal a lot of forces to drive good policy. So, Alan, as always, thank you for that really important insight.
The only other thing, I would say to the whole group is, as you all probably know, Australia and Norway have absolutely going into their legislators with 16 and under are banned in Australia, 15 and under will be banned in Norway if they get delayed. The most important thing we are going to succeed is we collaborate and we understand what some of the flashpoints are that these other governments have come in.
Great, thank you. And again, really thank you to the organizers for a fantastic session of senior policy people from the federal government and from a close watcher of and facilitator of the work happening in states. So again, great session, and Chelsea, thank you again.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we just heard actually a number of mentions of California, which has been doing and trying to do some interesting things in this space. And our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about the organizational and community work that is underpinning some of those initiatives in California. We're going to be joined by Jennifer Heffron, who's the Children Wellbeing Program Director at the California Partners Project, where she leads programming that's focused on supporting families in general as they navigate the challenges of raising children, but certainly currently with a particular focus on what it means to raise children in the digital age. She's going to join us and share some insights on approaches to tech-life balance and helping families thrive in a digital world. So, Jennifer, we're so happy to have you.
Thank you. All right. There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. My name is Jen Heffron, as Dr. Kiston just announced, and I lead the child wellbeing programming at the California Partners Project. So I'm coming from the Bay Area. Probably explains why I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt in November in Washington, D.C., but I'm going to represent. I first want to thank Brown and the Hassenfeld Child Health Institute for having me. It's a pleasure to be out here, and I'm really excited to be with you all and see some new faces and friendly faces. As a parent of 3 kids myself, 12, 10, and 2, I feel the push and pull of technology in our family life every day. And previously, having worked for over 12 years in K-12 schools in the Bay Area as a teacher and a learning specialist, I very much saw the change and the shift in kids pre-COVID and post-COVID when it comes to thinking about technology and education in kids and families. And I'm constantly negotiating screen time and device use and boundaries with my kids, encouraging them to embrace real-life interactions and value time outside and time in person, and the importance of unstructured play. But no matter how hard my partner and I try, it's really tough. And as some of you have already mentioned, even working in this field and being an expert in some of these things does not give you a free pass from some of the challenges. And I know this struggle is shared by families everywhere. So we're here today because we all really recognize both the tremendous power that social media holds, but also the serious challenges that it presents. So we know that social media is here to stay. We are not trying to talk about abstinence of social media or bans of social media altogether. But it's getting more complex, and it's reshaping childhood, it's impacting family dynamics, and it's even impacting how we define well-being when we talk about kids today. So we know that as parents, leaders, and experts, we have a unique opportunity to ensure that the benefits of technology don't come at the expense of our kids' mental health, which is why we're all here. So today I hope to share more about what we're doing in California specifically and at the California Partners Project as we listen to families and collaborate with experts and legislators. So what is the California Partners Project? So we are a nonprofit that was co-founded by California's first partner, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, so Governor Gavin Newsom's wife, and Olivia Morgan, who's the other co-founder, to champion gender equity and ensure our media and technology industries are a force for good in the lives of all kids. So our organization is a nonprofit, we're not a state agency, but we work alongside the first partner and her team to utilize research, convene stakeholders, and create resources with and for parents, youth, and families. So our work is driven by 3 key values: partnership, equity, and innovation. And these values guide everything that we do, from engaging families, advocating for policies that protect youth. In California, as Chelsea so wonderfully talked about, we are setting a strong, proactive example for children's online safety. So as our political landscape shifts, it's clear that states must continue to lead in legislating for the safety of kids and families online. So California's bold measures really serve as a model for the nation, demonstrating the powerful impact of state-level action. Even though they are being litigated and challenged, we're taking a stab at it. We're making the effort, and we're going to see what sticks. So as Chelsea mentioned, our first in the nation California Age-Appropriate Design Code inspired similar laws around the country that were actually able to amend or work around some of the issues in the language of the law that were litigated in California, and without that model, they wouldn't have been able to do that. And this September, so very recently, Governor Newsom furthered our commitment as a state by signing into law the Social Media Addiction Act, the Phone Free Schools Act, and SB 1283, which just has the law marker, which gives schools the ability to restrict to restrict social media use during the day on both personal and school-approved devices or school-provided devices, which is something that came up earlier today. So again, the impact is really in the implementation of these policies. So again, working collaboratively with key stakeholders to roll out these new laws is something that's definitely happening now. So these policies underscore California's dedication to protecting kids both at school and at home, creating safer and more mindful digital spaces designed with children's best interests at heart. So our approach, and I think this speaks to why I love to do what I do, really recognizes that genuine change requires action across 4 interconnected levels. So as others mentioned, there are systems and structures that influence the day-to-day experience of youth and parents, and there are other levers and ways that we can affect change. So at the personal level, our organization is trying to empower parents with tools to reflect on their own digital habits and attitudes, as we touched on earlier. At the interpersonal level, we're providing families with resources to strengthen their communication and reduce tech-related tensions at home. At the institutional level, we're setting high standards with groundbreaking policies and multi-billion-dollar investments, you talk about putting your money where your mouth is, in youth mental health to create a community-based pipeline of practitioners and to increase mental health screenings. And at the cultural level, we're really trying to change the culture of well-being by transforming schools into community hubs that prioritize mental health and offer essential services for kids and families that provide alternatives to time online. So altogether, these initiatives ensure that Californians have the support that they need to thrive. And I see that some of the slides are getting cut off, so hopefully what I say will mirror that. So, in addition to efforts to hold tech companies accountable for the impact their platforms have on young users, we're really trying to meet families where they are at the personal and interpersonal levels. So last month, our organization launched a series of reports and family guides with resources and tools to help caregivers navigate a digital world with young people. To inform our resources, we started by listening. California is incredibly diverse, so what works for one family doesn't work for another family. We organized English and Spanish focus groups and conversations with caregivers, again, speaking to California's diversity. Almost half of our state speaks Spanish, either as a first language or a second language. So families were asked about the impact of digital media on social emotional health, physical activity, nutrition, and sleep. And it's really critical, and again, going to changing the culture of well-being, we're really trying to think about this issue holistically across different aspects of a child's life. So after listening to experts, we talked to experts and researchers, and shout out to Jackie, who's here, who's one of the experts that we talked to, across disciplines who provided practical advice based on their fieldwork, which further shaped our understanding of these issues. So we tried to really take a multi-perspective approach that ensures that our resources are both data-driven, so grounded in science and research, and also reflect the lived experiences of families. So a little bit more about what we did. So we worked with community partners to connect with parents and caregivers across the state, really trying to aim for a representative group, knowing that it's impossible to capture every single person's perspective, but trying to get as close as we could. Focus group participants were caregivers to 211 children, ranging in age from 0 to 25, with the majority of them having kids that were between 6 and 17, so really looking at school-age kids. 75% of the caregivers were mothers, but we also talked to fathers and we talked to grandparents, and 75% identified as low to middle income. So these weren't, the privileged families at the top who are really elevating this issue. We really tried to speak to everyday Californians. And we also had geographic representation, again, really leaning on our community partners to help us access parents and caregivers in their communities. And the experts and researchers that we talked to and that we interviewed work in psychology, technology, child development, neuroscience, pediatrics, education, media studies, advocacy, government, and more. So not just really looking at one perspective or one set of expertise, but really trying to understand how different folks who touch on this issue are really thinking about it and what they're learning. So the breadth and scope of our discussions with caregivers demonstrate that they are really thinking deeply about how best to manage the impact of digital technology and media on their children. And we heard from wonderful parents who are doing that advocacy work and thinking deeply about this for themselves as well. So the challenges. So as we all know, and we heard earlier today, screens and devices are a nearly universal experience for kids growing up today. This was reflected in the caregiver responses to our baseline questions. More than half of caregivers reported that their children have a smartphone, and nearly all that their children have access to social media, even if they didn't have a phone or a smartphone. In a screen-saturated world, technology is seen as a double-edged sword, and Marco spoke to this earlier. On the one hand, social media supports long-distance connections, creative outlets for kids, and lots of other benefits. And on the other, it risks exposure to harmful content and can also foster dependency with persuasive and addictive features. So, caregivers reported feeling really burnt out trying to manage screen time, trying to monitor online behavior and keep up with their kids' digital world. So again, not new things, but really affirming and really deepening some of the experiences that you heard earlier today. So one thing I think that's really important to our organization and how we think about this issue in California is that as we consider the challenges of raising kids today, one thing is really clear, and this came out in our focus groups and our conversations. Parents need support. They don't need fear. So in this unique generation gap, caregivers don't have their own experience to guide their parenting. You know, I'm not asking my 71-year-old mother or my 80-year-old father for advice or expertise on how to talk to my sixth grader when it comes to whether or not they can have a smartphone or access to social media. So parents shared that learning from their kids feels really scary, like not being the expert, and that by the time parents figure something out, their kids are already on to the next thing. So, you know, earlier speakers talked about the rapidly evolving. So it's different. This technology and this digital age is different in the speed at which it's progressing and changing. Others mentioned the rise of intensive parenting. So parents are being inundated with messages that being a good parent means constantly knowing where your kids are, that it means having to monitor them and keep them safe at all costs. And obviously as parents we want to keep our kids safe, but when we really think about how we grew up, and the majority of us turned out hopefully okay and relatively safe, it's different today. So fear-based messages really heighten the anxiety of parents and contribute to feelings of helplessness, often leaving parents feeling paralyzed, as Dr. Radesky said earlier, or ashamed. So when we inform and empower parents, we give them the confidence to make thoughtful choices, to have intentional conversations about technology. Another thing that families shared is that kids often feel anxious and frustrated when they're disconnected from their devices. If we have, kids, or you have devices, or you've been around kids, you know this. It leads to emotional outbursts, and for many of them, overstimulation. So setting device or app limits often creates tension and leads to more conflict in the family. Parents also reported that that meaningful in-person interactions, and we talked about this morning, have been replaced with phones and social media, which often serve as an emotional crutch. So instead of experiencing boredom, which I had to do for many hours growing up, or sitting with uncomfortable emotions, or for a lot of our older adolescents, really stumbling through a potentially awkward social interaction, kids often retreat to the relative safety of what's online because that feels easier and it feels more comfortable. So these challenges are real. We're here to talk about solutions, so I'm excited to dig into that. They're not the whole story. The challenges are not the whole story. So from our conversations, we learned that even in the toughest moments, there are some really practical things that parents and families can do to regain balance. And many of the best solutions that we included in our resources come straight from what we heard from families and experts. Small shifts can make a big difference. So let's dive into the insights that are helping families navigate screens and social media in ways that support their connection and well-being and don't detract from it. So first, parents emphasized, and this has come up throughout the day, the importance of modeling healthy digital habits. We heard it from the young folks that were up here earlier, we heard it from the parents, and almost every speaker. So it's really important to acknowledge that children follow adults' lead when it comes to balancing devices and personal connections. So we are setting the norm or the default for the kids around us. Caregivers also noted that outdoor activities, so again, this goes to parental modeling, outdoor activities and routines are crucial to maintain family bonds. One parent shared that if they want their kids to be outside, they have to be outside, right? They can't sit inside all day and then tell their kids to go outside. Families that stay active together reported stronger communication and less reliance on screens. Caregivers and experts alike talked about the importance of getting to know your kids, which also came up. So what is it about social media that makes it fun for them? You know, why do they like this influencer? Why are they spending their time online? So communication grounded in curiosity really supports that relationship building and trust. Again, this was only underscored by the youth panelists earlier. And parents who listen without an agenda reported closer bonds and less conflict with their kids. And I think we all know, you know, as parents, that when you do have that breakthrough connection and communication, it really makes all the difference. And at the end of the day, At the end of the day, a truly powerful protective factor for kids online is something really timeless and essential. So yes, while this digital age is different and while parenting is in a modern era is more complex and challenging, at the same time, there are a lot of age-old solutions that we can think about and we can turn to. And that is a strong relationship with a trusted adult. So when kids feel connected to their parents, they're more likely to share concerns, and it might not even be a parent. Their caregiver might be a teacher, as one of the young people mentioned earlier today, or their trusted adult. They make safer choices, and they navigate digital spaces with resilience. By focusing on building open and supportive relationships, parents create a foundation that no app or policy can replace, providing a true anchor in an unpredictable digital world. So, the California Partners Project new parenting series, Tech Life Balance, which you can check out by using the QR code, really synthesizes what we heard from families and experts, and I just shared a little bit about what we heard. You know, for years, we've really talked about work-life balance. I know for myself, I'm still working on the work-life balance bit. But now families really need tech-life balance. So again, this is not about going back to the 60s and 70s, you know, when we didn't have all these things. It's really about how do we coexist in a way that does not detract from our well-being, both as individual kids and adults, but also as a family unit. So again, really thinking about the family system. And we hope that these resources help people achieve it. So these tools are really designed to support parents and caregivers, but to be clear, as we've talked about, this challenge isn't parents alone to solve, right? We talked about the 4 interconnected levels. So addressing the impact of devices and social media on family life requires all of us, whether we're caregivers or parents, government, tech companies, researchers, schools, and communities all working together to really harness tech for good. So our first report and guide focuses on social emotional health with future resources that are going to look at exercise, nutrition, and sleep. We focused on these 4 pillars of well-being because we consider them to be antidotes to time online. That's how we really think about it. So, you know, if we want our kids to be off devices, then what they're doing in the real world needs to be healthy, it needs to be attractive for them, and it needs to be engaging. So spending time with friends, moving their bodies, sleeping, eating well. So navigating tech with kids is a 21st century parenting skill. And we hope that these tools will help families have some of those tough modern day conversations about responsible tech use and social media use. Digital technology will always be a part of our lives now, but with intentional strategies, thoughtful policies, and community collaboration, we can really help families achieve balance in a tech-driven world. So what can you do? Hopefully, we hope that you will explore and share our resources and look out for the ones coming. Our goal, again, is to really restore agency, a sense of agency, and hope. And we are very, very dedicated to collaborating with policymakers, youth, we can't leave them out, and industry to advocate for child-centered, family-friendly platforms. So please engage with folks on the ground in your communities, in your states, in your neighborhoods, and create community partnerships to really support kids' well-being online and offline. And lastly, and this is speaking from my heart and speaking from my experience, our kids are watching us closely, whether we're parents, policymakers, researchers, community leaders. I know we all wear multiple hats. They see the choices we make. We heard that from the kids earlier today. And as challenging as it can be, small intentional decisions to prioritize presence over distraction and connection over convenience are places where we can have an immediate impact. So together, I hope that we all make those moments count for them and for us. Thank you. And I don't think we have time for questions, so find me if you have any questions.
All right, Jen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed seeing how much in your work in California really resonated with the report that we have from National Parents Union and Parent Voice, and how many threads I think were touched on by the panelists that we've had so far. It is my pleasure now to introduce the teacher and educator panel. And I want to take just a minute to say that, as you look at your program, unfortunately, Superintendent Francisco Duran was not able to join us today. He woke up sick and did not want to come into the space and get anybody else sick. I think that is a side effect of working closely in schools. We do have a quick video that I think talks a little bit. So Superintendent Duran is superintendent of schools in Arlington, and has taken a really thoughtful approach this year to thinking about keeping phones out of schools, but really working closely together with the teachers and other folks in the community to try to find out what works best. And so I'm told that we have a brief video about this that we'll start with, and then I'll introduce the folks who are coming up. Quick commercial. You've all gone a long time without seeing ads, I think, today, so we're going to work that out. All right, so that's a little bit about what's happening in Arlington. We're sorry to not have him with us, but we do have two terrific people that I'd like to invite up to the stage right now. So this panel is going to include some insights from Ariana Prothero, who's a reporter and assistant editor at Education Week, and is going to talk about some of the things that Education Week has been following that are happening in schools across the country. And she's going to speak first on that and then have a conversation with Dr. Jennifer Lillis, who is joining us from the Wheelock Education Policy Center at Boston University. And we're so happy to have you both here today.
Panelists. We are going to dive into the topic of device use and the impact of social media in schools. We're really thrilled to have these two panelists who have come to us with experience to reflect the experiences of many people on the ground. First, Ariana Prothero is an assistant editor and reporter at Education Week. We're going to start with Ariana. You know, when you're doing research for these kinds of conferences, you really want to get to some of the very best people, which is why you're all here. As I was reading, and Caroline was reading a lot of articles about this topic of schools, Ariana was just a fountain of articles from Education Week, which is a nonprofit news organization that has covered K through 12 education since 1981. Then we used some of those articles to share with our youth at Youth Pride to give them a sense of a lot of perspectives, because Ariana has been dedicated to talking to school administrators, teachers at all levels of schools, students and parents. And she has really, I think, done a great job of reflecting their voice in her reporting. So she's going to kick us off to set the stage for this discussion. And Ariana, thanks for all your ongoing work.
Absolutely. So I'll start with talking about some trends that I've seen in my reporting. As Elizabeth said, I cover technology and student well-being and the intersection of the two at Education Week. So in practice, that means I'm basically only reporting on cell phone bans and social media right now. That's just my job. And as you mentioned, I talk to a lot of students, parents, a lot of teachers, a lot of principals, and two kind of major themes that have emerged in my work is that one, pretty much everyone's very concerned about the effects of cell phone use and social media use on youth. And the other theme is that nobody really knows what to do about it. And this is sort of my favorite, as a journalist, not as a parent or a civilian, but this is my favorite point in the life cycle of a societal issue when everyone's like, oh, this is new. What do we do? What are you doing? What are they doing? What am I supposed to be doing? And the only answer is to just experiment. And getting to watch schools and educators experiment and try to figure out how to address this and approach this has just been absolutely fascinating. And I've seen so many different approaches. And I'll mention a story I did in the spring where I talked to two principals. One was a principal of middle school where they decided to ban cell phones. They were like, this problem is bigger than us, and we see no other option but to ban cell phones. And I talked to a principal of a high school in the other part of the country, and they had done the opposite. They reversed a ban and had started encouraging students to use cell phones and for teachers to incorporate cell phones into instruction. And what was interesting is both principals were very happy with their new policies, and they were both working swimmingly. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how that works. And it just sort of, underscores that idea that this is just a time of experimentation. A few other trends that I've noticed is that students tend to have a much more nuanced view towards social media than adults. At Education Week, we have a research center that regularly surveys educators and students. And we found through that survey work that I think in our most recent survey, about 3/4 of students said that social media has either a neutral or positive impact on their mental health. Meanwhile, hop over to our educators where we survey teachers and principals and district leaders, and about 9 in 10 say that social media has a either somewhat negative or very negative effect on teens' mental health and well-being. So you can see very divergent opinions on how social media is affecting youth. Another trend I've noticed is that while parents really share the same concerns as educators around social media and how it might hurt youth mental health, their opinions on cell phones in schools are pretty far apart. So while they agree on social media, educators really want, for the most part, cell phones out of schools, whereas parents are not comfortable with that. And interestingly, as a recent survey from the National Parent Union found that a lot of parents want their kids to have access to their cell phones so that they can check on their mental health during the school day. So there's a very circular argument there. And finally, another big trend that I've noticed is that while many schools, and we've seen this in our survey work, do have cell phone policies, educators report there are cell phone policies in their schools, they are not getting enforced. That is one of the biggest complaints I hear from educators, and in particular teachers, is that cell phone policies are not enforced either at the district level or the school level or by fellow teachers. And then I think if you've seen here, another sort of, we're kind of at this point in time where we're starting to see a lot more legislative action, a lot more action at the policy level, much more aggressive action in addressing social media and cell phones. We talked about in an earlier panel about social media. At EdWeek, we also track state cell phone policies, and by our count, there's 18 states now that either ban or restrict cell phone use in schools or recommend that districts have a district level policy. And I think those are the major trends I've noticed, but I'm curious to hear what other people have seen in their own
We're going
work.
to turn to Jen in a moment. Dr. Lillis, I just wanted to put what Superintendent Duran would have put into the mix and just get you guys' reaction to it. The Board of Arlington Public Schools approved a new policy which is a pilot policy that requires elementary and middle school students to keep phones, quote, off and away during the entire school day, and high school students to keep them off and away during instructional time. So it's a pilot policy because Governor Youngkin passed an executive order in Virginia requiring that all school districts have a formal policy by December of 2024. And Superintendent Duran and his team had wanted to have some trial run and to get some feedback on it. So this is a policy that varies by the age of students. And I want to first ask you, Jennifer Lillis has worked a lot with high school students at Jeremiah Burke High School in Boston. She has worked on college and career readiness and engaging with students in that way. But before we go there, do you have any reaction to the policy I just read from Arlington in terms of the age variation between elementary, middle, and then high?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I would say first that I love the idea of piloting different strategies and seeing how they work in schools. I feel like there's a lot of nuance to a school policy that goes way beyond just, do you have a cell phone ban or do you not have it? You know, we've heard about the pouches, we've heard about kids putting the phones away themselves, and you know, when and where to use the phones. And I think the policies should even go beyond that, to think not just about when and how students should use their phones, but also you know, some of the pieces that we've talked about around media literacy and preparing students for you know, the digital world after high school. So I like that idea of really having some pilots that can inform schools and districts beyond just like, you should have a cell phone policy or you shouldn't have it, but how do you actually implement it in a way that's working for teachers, working for families, working for students, and doesn't create additional tension between teachers and students in schools. So I think that's one piece, and I also really like the idea of having some type of gradual release strategy. You know, I think that as students get older in high school, you know, they're developing their ability, their self-regulation skills. And I think, you know, thinking about, you know, I was developing an early college program for our school. And one of the things that we thought a lot about was how do we make the high school experience feel a little closer to the college experience so that when students are making that transition, it feels more seamless, doesn't feel like such a big jump between what the expectations are. And so in our early college pilot, we were really trying to help students become more aware of their use, especially like students had study halls where they were supposed to be writing papers, and it's really hard sometimes, you know, like when you're starting to do something challenging, I think the phone can become even more of a distraction, right? Because you're like, oh, would I rather write a paper or check my TikTok? And so kind of just helping students become more aware of that and learning those self-regulation skills so that when they're going to college, going into the workplace, they're like more prepared, you know, to do that as well.
Well, thanks. That's really, really helpful to hear. And turning back to Ariana, I know that you have also sort of covered children and youth mental health as it happens in schools. What have you been hearing in terms of the connection of these two issues, of social media and student and youth mental health, young children as well?
Yeah, this is interesting because right now the narrative really seems to be, and so EdWeek, in addition to my just talking to a lot of educators, as I mentioned, we survey educators, and we do this every other month. We have a regular survey that goes out, and we have an open-ended question on every survey where we just say, sound off on whatever you want. And it's almost always about cell phones and social media. They could talk about anything, but what they talk about is cell phones and social media and youth mental health and how addictive social media is and how it is just absolutely destroying students' mental health. But what I find interesting as a reporter, and sorry, I might be a little over-caffeinated. I'll try to slow down. I'm sorry if I'm going a little fast. I'm very excited about this topic. What I find interesting as a reporter is people were really worried about kids' mental health years and years ago, and the narrative is really coalesced around social media, and I feel like there's been this collective amnesia about all of the mental health concerns that existed during the pandemic, and everyone said it was the pandemic. And before the pandemic, it was all these other things, and I worry a bit that maybe we're laying the blame at the feet of social media, but if we took it away, these problems might persist. I think one of our speakers was talking about kids' lack of sleep. So that's a trend that I've noticed that, you know, I would be interested to hear from Jennifer if that's something that's like bleeped on your radar.
Yeah, I think I think that there is this tendency to like blame the phones for everything, and I think that is something that we have to be really careful about. Yeah, I mean, I would say for us, you know, I started, I left the schools for a little while to get my doctorate, and then I started in September of 2021. So it was right when we were all coming back to school after the pandemic, and I had heard from colleagues in my school that like regulating the phones had been like much easier before the pandemic. They had like a pretty good rhythm around the expectations in the classrooms, and one that seemed to be working for like teachers and students. And then coming back from the pandemic, that it felt like something that we had really lost. And I think the device use was like really surprising and hard for us as teachers, as educators in the school. But also we were trying to balance regulating that with you know, promoting sense of belonging and not wanting to get into power struggles with students, and, you know, like trying to address like you know, the huge range of challenges that we were all facing in terms of like mental health and trying to come back from the pandemic. So I think it is, you know, like a little much to put it all on the phones. I also just want to quickly say one thing about just teacher well-being and teachers' mental health. And I think so I've worked a lot in schools and college and career readiness, but some of the research that I also do is around working conditions for special education teachers. And, you know, we all know that there's a huge teacher shortage, and a lot of teachers are leaving the profession. And I don't blame the phones for that, but I will say that it's something that educators are really struggling with a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think In our work around working conditions, we think a lot about the balance between demands and resources for educators, and that when those resources and demands are really unbalanced, that's when teachers get really burnt out. And I think that this is a space where that's the case. Like, there's not good resources to really help educators, figure out what are the best policies. As we've talked a lot about, things are always changing, and educators are kind of expected to keep up with that. Not only expected to keep up, but have lesson plans that incorporate, these new tools. And so I think that, just also sort of adding that into the conversation, that we're also thinking about like the educator well-being and the stress that it can cause for them as well.
You said something about the friction that cell phones can cause between teachers and students, and wanting to avoid that post-pandemic. That is something that I hear a lot from educators, that it creates that friction, but also it can create friction with parents. And if a student is saying, well, I'm responding this text message because it came from my parent, which is why so many teachers that I've heard from have talked about the need for not classroom level cell phone policies, but really having district level policies that are enforced by principals and district leaders, because that kind of takes it out of the hands of educators. Anyway, I just wanted to follow up with that.
Yeah, I think that is really important to have policies that are consistent. I mean, we had a policy in BPS, and I think if you went to like every high school in BPS, you would see like different cell phone use. So, I totally agree that I think that that's really important, but I think that it's like much harder said than done, especially because, like, as you mentioned, you were talking about two different principals that had like very different philosophies about technology use in schools and in the classroom. And in our school, we actually had that as well. Like, I'm not there this year, but there's a new principal that is kind of going that same route of not wanting to regulate technology, really wanting to embrace the phones, based on his values and philosophies as an educator, which is different than the Boston Public Schools policy. Hopefully, I'm not getting anyone in trouble, but I think there is like school cultures are different, schools' values are different. The capacity of different schools to enforce those policies is really different. Boston Public Schools is definitely, fairly inequitable. There's a lot of disparities just across the high schools in the district. And so I think that I do think that it helps teachers to have that consistency, but I think that there's like a lot of nuance there in how to make those effective.
I just want to turn back to Ariana just to follow up on this. What are some of the things that you're hearing from educators time and time again about cell phone use and what they're trying to do as teachers? I think we heard some really interesting comments from youth about when they're with engaging teachers, their phone is the last thing that they want to even think about. I think that's a really important point. But just thinking about teachers going back into the classroom, as you both said, after the pandemic, very high stress levels, and then encountering not just the mental health issues that were very present among their students before the pandemic, but then they go back after the pandemic. Jen, you talked a little bit about the different kind of overwhelmingly more use of devices just because people have been through the pandemic and being remote. But anyway, they come back, and then there's just burgeoning mental health issues and the issue of cell phone use in schools. And how's that been hitting them, and what have they been telling you?
From the educators I've spoken to, this is an educator perspective, so probably most people are going to think they're amazing educators and always interesting. So they don't, right, I think I'm interesting and amazing, so why wouldn't, you're not going to be like, actually, yeah, I think the issue here is I'm a terrible presenter and I'm not engaging, and that's why my kids are on their cell phones. So that's not an issue that I've really heard from educators. That's one I hear more from students. I really think that, and Jennifer kind of touched on this, that it does vary a lot from student population to student population, vary a lot from school culture to school culture. Going back to that assistant principal I talked about who banned cell phones in his class, he had a middle school population. And they were having a very distinct issue with, they had anonymous gossip pages on various social media sites where kids were just kept taking pictures, unsolicited pictures of each other, and anonymously posting them. I mean, taking pictures in the locker room. I mean, just things he was contacting the social media companies and saying, can you take these pages down? Kids were getting in constant fights about it. Like, there were lines out the door for his office, for the school counselor's office. And what they came to is we just have to shut it down. There's no way we can check every kid's phone coming out of the locker room to make sure they didn't have pictures on there they shouldn't have taken. But that was more of a middle school population. Going back to what Jennifer said, I've heard from educators that this is a little bit easier to manage, not always, but sometimes at the high school level where kids are getting a little bit more maturity. And I'm seeing a little bit of a coalescing around cell phone bans that are stricter at the earlier ages and then get a little bit more lenient in the later grades, because kids not only have a little bit more maturity, but also they have they need to learn how to function with their device there, because nobody's going to be banning cell phones in their college courses or at school. And the last thing I want to say is I think it also varies on how much pressure the teacher feels to catch kids up academically, like their particular school population and how far behind they fell during the pandemic. And I think there's just cell phones are just seen as a much greater existential threat and the distractions they cause, because every single second of that class time counts, and losing a second to a ding or a notification is just it just has such a higher risk than maybe kids who just came out of the pandemic doing better, aren't as behind academically, and they just have a little bit more wiggle room for those distractions.
One of your areas of expertise is special education, and as a person who teaches special education and works with special education educators, is there anything that you'd like to talk about in that space? Because so often we have these conversations and we're not enough talking about students with IEPs, students with special needs. What are some of the issues that special education teachers face, if that's a question that you feel like you'd like to answer?
I know, I was thinking about this, and I don't know if it's really something that I can speak to super well, honestly. Just given the role the roles that I've had, I will say that I think that some of the value that technology brings can sometimes really support students with disabilities in specific ways, whether it's organizational tools. I worked with college students on the autism spectrum, and we were using technology a good amount for executive functioning. That's something that we were using with all of our students. I was telling students, just in some of the roles that I was working with them on around college planning or their internships or things like that, get out your phone and put a reminder, set a timer for the work that you're doing. So I think, potentially there's some really nice uses for a variety of tools that can support students with disabilities and students without disabilities, that's on students' devices. That was something that also came up with our early college class. So we were trying hard to make sure that students in the early college program, if they were eligible, could get access to accommodation from the colleges. And that's a really important skill for them to learn, so that when they go to college, they'll know about those resources and access those. And we definitely had students who then could get audio textbooks. And I know that this is a little different than social media, although I feel sometimes from an educator perspective, taking out the device, it's challenging, right? Because it can be so useful in one way, but we know that you're using it for multiple things at the same time. And so it can be both a really useful tool and a distraction at the same time. But we had students who were using the note takers and some other technologies to help them be more successful in their classes as well.
We're actually already winding down on time. It goes by fast. Great conversation. Ariana, from your reporting, are there other things that you would like to, this is an audience of people who really want to take action. They really want to, whether it's through their research, through the roles that they play in their communities, the parents here, the students here. What are some things that you sort of see on the horizon as so many states are doing statewide action? And some of the other things that you've heard that you maybe have not gotten into the conversation yet.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, there's been a lot of focus on cell phones and social media, but as one of the students said, it was such a powerful thing. She has a social worker, or school counselor that's only on Wednesdays, and so she can only have a breakdown on a Wednesday. I think that, there needs to be continued focus on mental health resources in schools. That's something I've reported a lot on. We just don't have a good mental health infrastructure outside of schools. And I've spoken to so many school psychologists and counselors that will say, I refer these kids out to specialists in the community, and their families come back to me because they can't get in to see a specialist. And so schools have become the de facto mental health care system for much of our youth, and they just don't have the resources to meet the demand. So right now, a lot of the conversation is focused on cell phone bans, but I think eventually this is all going to come back down to the mental health resources that schools have.
Well, I think if you guys don't mind, if I stop our conversation now, we can get a few questions in the queue.
Sure.
So does anyone have a question? Alan?
Ariana or Jennifer, I'm not sure who this is for. It might be for Elizabeth. There's one party that we haven't talked about at the table, and maybe because I'm a Rhode Islander, I think a lot of the AFT and the NEA. Where are the unions on this whole issue in basically working for the teachers and helping them?
Do you want to start?
Well, I do know that I can't say that I know of any collective bargaining contracts that address cell phones. So put a pin in that. It would be interesting to know, something I should look into. But I do know that a couple examples of principals and superintendents going to their union and sort of outsourcing to the union, saying, "Can you talk to your members and bring back to us what they need in terms of a cell phone policy, what they're experiencing, what the friction points are." So I have seen examples of school districts turning to the unions to help address these issues.
Yeah, I can't think of an example in BPS, but I do know that. Yes, sorry. I do know that the union is advocating for increased mental health resources in schools and more school counselors.
I bring it up only because these could be partners
Mm-hmm.
down the road.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good point, and something that we need to pay attention to, and something that probably some internal conversations among union leaders are very much on the table. Other questions? Yes. That's Pia back there.
On? Oh.
Yes.
So my father has been a public high school teacher for over 15 years. And when I was in 6th grade, I experienced a cyberbullying issue. And so as a result, my father has been trying to advocate for schools he's in Florida high school teacher. He's been trying to advocate for having courses in technology and social media at all the school levels, and it has not been implemented. The solution is cell phone bans and regulations in schools, but not teaching kids about how the social media works, how technology works. And so I was wondering, have you guys been seeing people implement these classes, especially at young ages? Because my father says, I really wished that we had been teaching these things at 8 and 9 when we knew social media was already a thing, and that we could have prevented these cases of cyberbullying, because he does view social media as a positive thing, but what he really wants is, as a teacher, not to be having to fight with his kids over taking the phone versus them having the respect to give up the phone out of respect for him in the school system.
Well, I think there are a lot of schools that are tackling digital and media literacy. I think it is something that is, I don't think, brought up enough when talking about cell phone bans. That I worry a bit with cell phone bans that as sort of a way of sort of ridding yourself of the issue, and something that I ask educators or principals or superintendents when they're talking about a ban is like, okay, well, do you also still see yourself or your school system playing a role in teaching kids how to use social media responsibly? Just because they don't have constant access anymore during school time, do you still see that as your responsibility? And I think that's an important question to ask. And I mean, personally, I think that's an important part of any cell phone policy. I think we're seeing more movement where, I mean, my kindergartner came home the other day with like a worksheet on like proper online behavior. It was really, I was, oh, okay. Like, I think, and one other point I want to make is I've talked to a lot of teens about what they want to see, and when we talk about cell phone restrictions and social media, they often say that they want more education on how to behave online, how to manage their online presence and behavior. And interestingly, something that's come up is they also want education on cell phone etiquette. And I think that's something older people take for granted, that you put something down and you look somebody in the eyes when you're having a conversation. And that's not something, if you've grown up with a device, that maybe you've picked up on, or maybe you were at this very critical developmental period in the pandemic and on Zoom classrooms. So that's something that I would like to see explored more, and something that I've written about is this idea of teaching cell phone etiquette to youth.
I'll just quickly chime in. I think it's something that I really wish our school had been doing more. And I think a couple of things that could have potentially helped with that. I think one, just having like a good repository of resources for teaching, because as we know, teachers are really taxed. And so like, I think having it just be up to like individual schools and educators to like educate themselves, get the information, create good lessons. I think if there was like better tools and ways of sharing that, that would be really helpful. I feel like I had something else. Oh, and then I think also just having schools share more with each other, like where they're fitting that into the curriculum, because our school was definitely one where we had a lot of competing demands in terms of academics, ensuring students that are passing the required tests to graduate from high school. And although I think many people in my school would have said that this is something that's really important, I think, really kind of thinking through not only like that it should fit, but where it should fit and how we can, balance that with other demands.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add really quickly, this is a thing I should have said. Another issue that I've run into is that something that I've talked to people about is that social emotional learning curricula tends to kind of exist in its own universe and isn't directly connected to digital and media literacy and how people behave online and cyberbullying, and that there needs to be more direct connection between those two.
If you've seen a pattern in terms of like how communication comes out with with like phone policy across the country whatsoever, and then it might be a small thing, but like in my experience, looking at how these phone policies are rolled out or communicated out to parents and families and students and so forth. One, it's just like, it just comes down the pike, like back to school when everything's just all up in the air, right? There's no forum to like, for both parents, students, teachers, schools to kind of create some understanding. And then the second thing is just about how layout is, right? And I was recently in a, group chat with other families, and, they were like, oh, this is a great phone policy, blah, blah, blah. And then just the layout in terms of like the punitive thing is up front, and then you talk about this caring school at the bottom. And so it may seem small, but to me, like as a parent reading that, I see where the priority seems different versus this is the school that we want your child to come to, and these are the ways that we feel that we can practice so that we create or nurture this environment of learning. So I'm just curious and interested in seeing like how phone policy or social media ban, how is that rolled out? And are there some best practices out there that you've seen?
We have time for a short answer to that from both of you. If we can start with you, Jennifer, and then go to Ariana, and then we're going to be closing up.
I think that's part of the reason that our school had been so hesitant to, be really strict with the cell phones was, because we were just putting a real priority on relationships and building culture within the school. And I think it left a void that did need to be addressed in terms of, just helping the phones not be a distraction in the classrooms. So I don't think I can really speak to the national trends, but I think that that's something that I would love to see in the policies going forward, that they're more collaboratively developed, and that it's not just about that restriction of like, this is where you can and cannot use your cell phone, but this is how the policy that we've created reflects our values in our community. If we are valuing connection, this is the way that our technology policy reflects that, for example.
Yeah, I think kind of a best practice that's emerging on this is that a school system should definitely get community feedback and should start by finding out why parents want their kids to have cell phones in schools, because that's a really good starting point for developing your policy and making sure you're developing a policy that's going to get buy-in. I think another important part is just for a school system to get out in front of any misinformation and be totally transparent and upfront and quick about it, because rumors spread pretty quickly among parent networks, as I think anybody who's a parent knows how that works.
Well, that winds it up nicely. And if Superintendent Duran had not been ill today, I know he, in the sort of the news coverage leading up to his policy, was a very big parent voice for phone restrictions in schools. So that happened to be Arlington, Virginia, but it kind of goes to the various perspectives that you've seen as you've interviewed individual administrators. So there's some parent voices rising on both sides just because of many of the things that we've heard today. And I just want to round up by saying thank you so much to our amazing panelists.